Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. Longtime readers and supporters of High Country News, as well as those who might be new to HCN. We are a nonprofit, reader-supported publication. We've been covering the West for more than half a century now. If you want to learn more about and support our work, please go to our website, hcn.org, to subscribe or donate. Still time to give a few gift subscriptions if you're doing your holiday shopping. So speaking of half-century milestones, we are marking the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act this month. And we're very fortunate to be joined live by Siva Sundaresan, who was appointed Deputy Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in late 2022. Before joining the agency, Siva spent nearly a decade as a conservation advocate in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, a place many High Country News readers know and love. Serving as Wildlands Director of the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance, and then Director of Conservation for the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Siva has a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, and he's studied species including Bengal tigers in India and zebras in Kenya, where he was program director for the Denver Zoological Foundation. So I hope we'll get a little time to talk about those experiences. Siva, just to get us started, you've spent most of your career as a wildlife ecologist and a conservation advocate. What role has the Endangered Species Act played in your work as a wildlife scientist and advocate?
Well, firstly, Michelle, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Love reading the High Country News, which I used to read avidly when I was living out west, and I've read some of your work, and just delighted to see the recent book, which actually our director Martha gifted to the secretary who loved it. So thank you for all that you've done, and clearly you guys and everybody here is sort of well aware of sort of half a century, 50 years of the Endangered Species Act, and so just what a wonderful chance to be here and talk with all of you. So yeah, and yeah, I think the whole conversation is going to be about sort of all the good things and sort of what we can do with the Endangered Species Act and sort of how wonderful it has been for biodiversity conservation. Yeah. So yeah, as you said, and thanks for that lovely introduction. Most of my career as a scientist sort of was in other countries before I really got familiar with the Endangered Species Act. But I learned many of the tools of science that then plays into what the Endangered Species Act sort of demands, right? As a bedrock conservation law that really focuses on species, nothing else like it really in most places. It's inspired and served as a model for legislation all across the world. As a scientist, you really sort of engage with the law using the tools of science. When we're talking about what is the probability of a population going extinct, or where is the critical habitat for a species, you're essentially dealing with sort of population models, demographic models, habitat selection, and things like that. And so that was really sort of my first sort of exposure to the tools of science as it relates to the law. In the sort of process of becoming an advocate, and sort of this happened to me early on in my career in India, I kind of learned science for the purpose of how can one use the tools of science to further the cause of conservation. It's very similar in advocacy, right? So the law in its intent is meant to conserve species and the ecosystems and habitat upon which they depend. And so as an advocate, you're constantly, or I was constantly asking myself, what can I use of this law to further the cause of conservation? Now, in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's usually with these hot button species, but it allows you to ask questions, working with all the other stakeholders in the landscapes of like, what aspects of this law are best served in the cause of conservation of those species. So that's really how I sort of touched and felt and interacted with the law. And sort of in grad school, like almost everybody else had probably been to grad school and studied sort of ecology or conservation, you did your sort of fair share of required policy classes where you read the Endangered Species Act sort of, and that was kind of more of the Endangered Species Act in a lab. Whereas as a scientist and as an advocate, I got to sort of touch and feel and play with it in the real world. Sort of now it's sort of even more real to me in this job.
Yeah, and what aspects of it, when you were working in Greater Yellowstone, what aspects of it did you find to be the most powerful as an advocate?
I mean, and and maybe this fits in with what I'm doing right now. I to a large extent, I felt that the law as it stands and the way a lot of people used it was a fairly narrow frame of should we list. And clearly that is a crucial and critical part of what the Endangered Species Act does. But I think we often fail to see that it's not the only thing that it does. There's so much more in the act that allows, encourages sort of conservation action writ large. And really, I think that's what sort of excited me, because all too often, if the narrow frame is should we list or should we delist, you can get into a sort of legal argument rather than sort of an on-the-ground argument of what the species requires in the real world. And so that really has been sort of my window into the sort of act as an advocate. And coming into the service and working with the service, I've realized now sort of what else you can do with it, right? So clearly listing is important, delisting is important. It's crucial. It's the sort of emergency room. It's the backstop. It's everything that we say it is. But there's so much more. There's so much more voluntary action. There's sort of collaborative action. There's interagency action that the law allows, that the law encourages. And that's where I think we have opportunity to actually make a difference on the ground in today's social, political, climate.
Yes. Right. I think those of us who care about wildlife and know something about the Endangered Species Act can sometimes get into the habit of thinking, oh, well, it's listed, the species is listed, it's safe. But that's really only the start of
Correct. Exactly.
making a species quote unquote safe. So
correct. I mean, listing in some ways is a means to a conservation end. And in some ways, it's also an admission that the species is really in trouble.
Right.
So we're in sort of an ironic stage where sometimes we celebrate listings, and I understand that it means that that species then gets the sort of protections it deserves and the attention it deserves. But really, the analog that we've often used and everybody uses is like, it's the sort of emergency room of species conservation. And so to think of yourself as like celebrating that, somebody was, is really sort of gravely ill and is in the emergency room is not really something you ought to celebrate.
Right.
You ought to celebrate sort of the care that they're getting and the attention, but it's kind of ironic in many ways.
Yeah, good point. Let me just mention that if you are listening on YouTube Live, please, and you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll see them and work them into the conversation. So, as you mentioned, you had a rather radical change of habitat in the last couple of years, and you've, I'm sure, learned a lot about the Endangered Species Act. Give us a couple of examples of these opportunities that you see to move beyond the is it listed or not listed, and work to restore populations to health on the ground.
Yeah, and I'll pick something that's probably in everybody's mind out west, and comes with its fair share of controversy. But the sagebrush, right? I mean, I think the conversation, and this happened sort of before I got to sort of the Department of Interior, but it's continued to be a recurring theme in conservation, and there are many aspects of it, I think, that really speak to how it's helped, right? So it's a species that really symbolizes an entire ecosystem. So it comes with a whole bunch of other stuff, everything from mule deer that migrate to sparrows and a bunch of other sagebrush dependent species. So conserving or protecting the sagebrush really is important, not just to the species alone, but to the entire ecosystem. So that's sort of really something profound and beautiful about the Endangered Species Act. The second is, I think, the potential decline of the species and the risk that it might be listed prompted and hopefully also sort of encouraged a bunch of people to really come together and figure out how we could do collaborative conservation action. And that really, I think, is the beauty of sort of conservation, right? So we've got now BLM doing sagebrush restoration. We've got private landowners doing it. We've got sort of states and tribes working on sagebrush. It's a huge priority for the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Department of Interior has prioritized a bunch of money. Congress, in their bipartisan infrastructure law, funded sagebrush restoration. And it's got ties into how we manage sort of vast landscapes and invasive species. And so it's really prompted sort of a huge amount of conservation investment, action on the ground, in a way that I don't think would ever have happened without sort of the Endangered Species Act. So that, I think, is sort of, to me, a really good example. Now, is it perfect? Clearly not. There's lots more that can be done. There's still a huge lot of sort of challenges in terms of how we're protecting habitat, where development is going, what development is going. Have we sort of flipped the curve on sage-grouse populations? So no, but really, I think it encapsulates the intent and the goal of what we'd like to see the ESA do for conservation of species.
And are there other places, other species where you see that model?
I'm trying to think of something else in the West. I recently sort of went, and this is going to sort of annoy High Country News readers, but down in the Southeast, in sort of some of the red-cockaded woodpecker longleaf pine habitat, we were working on sort of, really interesting collaborations between big private timber, the Department of Defense, and around how do we encourage conservation there, and using innovative models, right? So this will get a little bit into the weeds of how Endangered Species Act works, but encouraging conservation on private lands really means that the private landowners, whether they're timber operators or small family farms, who do good things for conservation, create salamander habitat or keep a tree with a red-cockaded woodpecker on it, don't get penalized for doing so. And so in order to do that, we have to, this Fish and Wildlife Service, sort of do some creative policy and innovative policy around sort of what we call our Section 7 or Section 10 consultation processes, or incidental take permits, or have safe harbor or candidate conservation agreements. And that's really where I think we're getting a lot of really interesting conservation action. And the West, I think we'd love to see more of this happening, especially right now when we're talking about sort of the push for clean energy and how sort of clean energy development is overlapping and intersecting with potentially endangered species. And there's a lot of opportunities there for interesting conservation action, whether it's around lesser prairie chicken or small endemics in Nevada.
So these are projects that are designed to keep species out of the emergency room, so to speak. What can be done? And I know you've thought a lot about what the meaning in your previous roles. You've thought a lot about the exact meaning of a healthy wildlife population. What can be done to not just keep species out of the emergency room, but keep them healthy? As both, in your position, but also what's the role of state and tribal governments in doing that?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think the beauty of this is that for the most part, sort of most healthy species are managed by sort of states and tribes, right? Like the Fish and Wildlife Service typically gets involved only when things get sort of unhealthy, so to speak. I'll give the sort of fairly obvious answers. Conservation needs investment, it needs funding. And conservation, I think we have to understand, especially in the world that we live in today, an investment into sort of conservation action is as economic an action as building roads and bridges, right? So, employing people to pull weeds or pull down fences or to sort of do habitat restoration or create trails, or all the other actions that we do for the sake of conservation and conservation-dependent recreation is as much an economic action as some of these other things. And hopefully those can go towards protecting biodiversity as we deem it. So I think funding conservation at the scale at which we need it is hugely important. I think the second thing that I really hope for is creating the space metaphorically for partnership, right? A lot of conservation action that has to happen on the ground has to happen in partnership with sort of, whether it's local landowners, states, tribes, sort of counties, different NGOs, the federal agencies. And often I feel like these days we are losing the space for partnership because we are unwilling to engage with the complexity and nuance that conservation action demands. And so if we can get those two things at the right scale done, I think we'll make significant progress in conservation.
And what needs to happen for that to happen, other than more money and time, which I think is the most obvious answer?
I mean, what I'd love to see and what I hope that we are trying to do at the Fish and Wildlife Service is when those local actions where partnerships are resulting in conservation action occur, that we are highlighting and showcasing them. And the other thing that we are actively trying to do with the Fish and Wildlife Service is encourage all of our staff to do so, right? The collaboration is a huge value that we hold. Now, it doesn't mean sacrificing your corely held conservation values. I care deeply about sort of animals and plants, and that's why I do this. But I have to find common ground around sort of building partnerships with other people and how we can make conservation happen. So I think if we can, the more we can do that, the better. And I'd like to think that we are, and hopefully others join as well. I mean, I don't know.
Good. I want to hear a little bit more about your previous experiences with collaboration. But before we move on, just tell us a little bit about your priorities in your position for the coming year. What will you be working on directly?
Oh, for sure. So and I think as everyone probably knows, this administration is prioritizing the big things, right? We have a climate crisis to deal with, we have a biodiversity crisis to deal with, and we're reckoning with the fact that conservation for too long has been sort of fairly narrowly defined in terms of the people engaged in it, and that steps down into a bunch of different things that we have to grapple with, right? So we have this sort of a large number of endangered species regulations, policies related to how the Endangered Species Act is implemented, various other migratory birds, Eagle Act implementation rules that will, in our opinion, hopefully protect species, eagles, endangered species, while also making it easier for sort of the development of clean energy, whether it's wind or solar or geothermal, right? So that we want to get those regulations done right, so we are protecting biodiversity and doing what we need to do for the climate, because species will go extinct if we allow sort of global warming to continue. The second thing that we're trying to do is, we had this unprecedented opportunity the last couple of years with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act to have significant investments towards conservation in a way that we've never had before. So we want to make sure that these investments are hitting the ground in the places that most need them, in a way that's collaborative, bringing together not just the Fish and Wildlife Service, but several other agencies. So, for example, literally last week, I came off of a meeting of 13 different federal agencies, all of whom have some investments, some money from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law towards fish passage. And so can we, as an entire federal family, coordinate our investments across the nation so we're putting it to ground, to water, in a way that really sort of promotes fish passage, and not just sort of, in the streams, but the habitat associated with it. So, I think broadly, those are the two things. And then we're going to continue our efforts within the service to make the service as a place for sort of more people, not just sort of one sort of ethnic group to kind of come and work in, but like make the service a little bit more open and inclusive, while also sort of making our refuges, the places that people come and visit, more open to sort of all people. So that's a huge priority for us. We're trying to sort of put energy and interest into our urban program, into our environmental justice program. So I would say those are the three priorities, and hopefully you'll see some movement on this in the next few weeks and months.
Great. So, speaking of the need for collaboration and bringing diverse groups together on conservation issues, I'm imagining that some of your research and your work as an advocate gave you some unexpected preparation for this, because you worked on what I think is really the hard cases of human-wildlife conflict, working on, Bengal tigers, which you really do pose sometimes fatal hazards to people. You worked on large mammals in Africa, and then of course grizzlies and wolves in the greater Yellowstone area. So what did those experiences, those really tough discussions, teach you about human coexistence with other species, how we can agree on how to live alongside these large, sometimes dangerous species?
Yeah, no, and happy to say, talk about this. I'll tell a slightly personal story. So the first real conservation experience that I had was in India on tigers. I was sort of a research assistant, essentially sort of surveying tiger populations. And it was at the peak when the idea was that the threat to tigers was tiger poaching, driven by a demand in sort of China and various parts of Southeast Asia for tigers. And this was when I was in India. And so usually the response to that was, hey, let's do some kind of PR campaign to sort of talk about why tigers shouldn't be poached, or some kind of law enforcement campaign. What sort of the research team I was a part of uncovered actually was that tigers really struggle when their prey are depleted, because then tiger moms don't have enough food to make tiger babies. I mean, it's as simple as that. And the hunting of prey is often done by small communities, very poor for subsistence, living on the edge of these national parks in India. And that was really a bigger, and often in the place that I worked, driver of population declines than poaching itself at the time. Things have changed now. Wow. And so what that meant, again, for our conservation team, and I was just a small part of it, was we really needed to work with that community and figure out how to help that community. And so that was much harder work, but that was really where the answer lay, right? So, I mean, and this has kind of been, I think, for me, a recurring theme. You use science, you use the data to understand what the problem is, and then you try to best address the problem, treating the people that most need solutions. And, working with communities is hard, it's not easy. And so that's kind of been, I think, the way I've approached conservation, whether it was in India or in Kenya with zebras, or in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And really, I think we talk always about human-wildlife conflict, right? Like the bear is sort of hurting people, and the tiger is eating somebody, or the zebras are eating grass that my cattle need to eat. And sure, there's that conflict there. But really, the second layer of conflict is often more important, which is the conflict between 2 different or 3 or 4 different groups of people who want different outcomes for that land or the wildlife. And that is where the management conflict lies. And so that's the problem that I think we need to think about how we address. And we address that by collaboration, through partnerships, thinking about innovative solutions, and approaching all of that with some degree of integrity and authenticity. So if we can do that, I think we'll get to solutions in these places. And it's not easy. It doesn't always work, and it takes creating sort of relationships of trust, and sometimes taking chances on things that don't always work. And then if the science says it doesn't work, you have to have the courage to say it didn't work. Let's try something different. So.
Yeah. What, I'm sure it's difficult to generalize, but when you think back on the kind of constellation of conflicts that you dealt with among people that you dealt with in Kenya and India, and then in the greater Yellowstone, what are the similarities and differences that jump out at you?
I mean, I think the similarities, and this will come across as sort of a little bit glib, but I think we need to treat people as people. Right? I mean, whether it's a rancher in Montana, or a Maasai pastoralist in Kenya, or sort of a tribal honey gatherer in southern India, people are people. And if we can approach sort of the problems they are facing with humility and respect, and think about things from their shoes, then I think we can get to some solutions, right? So that's the one sort of glib answer to the similarities. Now, there's obviously sort of huge differences, right? Like, in terms of economics, how much money people have, what sort of value systems they hold, how they feel about different species, what they're willing to tolerate and not tolerate, and how you get in the room and have conversations, how you structure these conversations, what solutions they need to see, how they engage with the broader political system. And that comes with sort of its own flavors. It takes some learning on all of our parts, but it's been sort of incredibly fulfilling me to have this sort of taste of a diversity of issues, and be a part of sort of solutions and failures in all these places.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you think people in the Western US, people who might be listening, could learn from people who are coexisting with predators in other parts of the world?
I mean, there's this sort of fairly obvious sort of like, hey, other parts of the world, there's the what I'd call the tools, right? Like, when we do this easily, and I think these are sometimes the easier solutions, right? Like, let's go to Eastern Europe and see what people are doing there with brown bears, and is there anything we can translate to the Western landscape with bears and wolves and those kinds of predator issues. Um, I mean, I'd go back to what I said earlier, right? Like, I think the West writ large, and if you don't mind, sort of more broadly on endangered species, is really dealing with so many different issues, right? Whether it's sort of small endemics in Nevada right next to a potential geothermal plant, or how are we going to deal with big transmission lines that are going to severe sort of sagebrush, sage grouse, or migratory routes, or where are we going to site solar? I think, and then how is that going to impact sort of not just wildlife but working lands? I think we have to sort of think about how do we take not just sort of regulatory side of the Endangered Species Act, but the more incentive, voluntary, locally led conservation encouragement side of the Endangered Species Act and see what we can do with that, right? So there's so much that we can do with voluntary conservation, with sort of habitat conservation plans and safe harbor agreements and candidate conservation agreements, and so many things like that. And I think we really haven't sort of fully taken out all those parts of the Endangered Species Act for a drive, and really that's something we ought to do and can do. All of that's going to require funding and partnerships, so yeah, that needs to come along with it as well.
Right, and trust from all the participants, which I know will take a while to build. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
As we get close to the end of our time, let me ask you a little bit about your early interests. I know you've said you can't remember a time when you didn't want to have a career working with animals, but you grew up in a big city in Chennai in India. So was there a person or an experience that inspired that love of animals?
Yeah, no, I do not remember. That's sort of, I mean, I've been told since I was a little kid. I mean, like, I think I never grew out of that stage where all children, when they're toddlers, go through loving animals, and that's always been sort of something I've been deeply passionate about. People make fun of me sometimes, even now, when I get so happy watching critters in the wild. It's like, it's a deep joy that's hard to express to people. Maybe if an artist sort of sees a cool painting, or a musician does something, it's the same joy that I get from watching animals in the wild. And so that's really been what's guided me. I mean, it's my career aspirations and ideas have matured a little bit since when I was 3 years old, but it's really all primarily driven by like being outside and watching cool animals. I mean, whether it's sort of tigers and bears and wolves, or sometimes wobblers that I'm just like learning about, or salamanders. There's just sort of pleasure there that's hard to convey in a video call like this. I don't really know who or what inspired it. Probably the first memory that I myself have that somebody didn't tell me about is when I was in elementary school. I somehow managed to convince a group of college kids in my hometown to take me along a walk on the beach late at night. We'd walk this lonely beach late at night looking for turtle nests. The sea turtles would come in and nest on the coast where I lived. It's literally about a 10-minute walk at my house, but we'd spend sort of all night from about like 10 p.m. till 3 a.m. walking up and down the beach several miles. And somehow I convinced these college kids to take me along, and it was fantastic. You'd see these olive ridleys, this turtle come up. You had to be really quiet and wait in the background till she came up, and she'd walk this beat, and then once she started nesting, you could literally walk up with the turtle and you could see them nest, and it was just sort of a spectacular experience that I'll never forget. And then after that, I just was, everything else is accident. I would write to people saying, hey, can I come and do wildlife stuff? And somebody'd say, yeah, come work with me, and I'd go work with them, and I sort of stumbled along until I ended up here.
Yeah. You've already spoken a bit about this, but it's so fundamental to what you do. I'll give you a chance to expand on it a bit. I think most people like you come to conservation because they love animals, they love plants, they love being around animals and plants. But I've heard many, many conservationists over the years say, but it's all about working with people.
Correct.
Successful conservation is all about working with people. So what are the most important things you've learned over the years about working with people? You've talked about treating others with respect and taking others seriously as individuals. What beyond that helps you build trust, especially in your current position as a government official coming into a community? How do you approach other people, and how do you build those relationships that can lead to conservation?
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, I think for a significant part of my early career, and we all to some extent romanticized the idea of whoever it is, right? Like the lone biologist sort of in this isolated place, never having contact with anybody else, learning about some unusual critter that very few people have ever seen or heard about. But I think when it comes to sort of the actual doing of conservation in society, I mean, it's a full contact sport, right? Like you have to work with the people that are impacted by and have a say in it, that have will either be harmed or helped by the decision. Um, and again, it comes down to those core values that we all hold, right? Like, can we collaborate with respect? Can we enter this space with integrity but openness, and find innovative solutions? So really, that's I think what it's about. Hopefully, uh, that's what we at the Fish and Wildlife Service are trying to do. I mean, if we kind of lay bare sort of the intent of a lot of these bedrock conservation laws, right? Like the Endangered Species Act or NEPA and all these other things, they are at core an attempt to sort of create spaces for people to have respectful, open dialogue about how we're going to negotiate solutions. And that's the sort of art of public policy, right? Like no solution is perfect for everybody, but can everyone see some part of that helps them in what they are trying to do? And if it harms them, is there a way in which the rest of us can help sort of address that, right? So if we as a collective want conservation of a species, which almost always we do, and that is going to harm one or other members of our community, is there anything we can do for them to help out? And so I don't know if I have any sort of unique insights into this that are different than most other folks that already work at this space, and I've worked in the space for much longer than I have. But to the extent that we can engage in conversations with sort of respect, integrity, and collaborate and create some innovative solutions, I think we'll go pretty far in species conservation. And unfortunately, we need to. I mean, the urgency is pretty stark.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just to wrap up, and thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you for the
What
opportunity.
Yeah, what do you wish more people in the US West, more Westerners knew or understood about the Endangered Species Act as we look back at its first 50 years and look forward to what's hopefully its next 50 years and beyond? What do you find
Yeah,
that you
and
wish people knew or understood more about the law?
sure, and I'll say this. I said this before, and I'll say this again. Right, the the listing, to list or not to list, is an incredibly narrow frame that oftentimes locks us into sort of a space that doesn't really allow us innovative solutions. So I would really hope that folks in the West, dealing with all the issues that we have right now, think about everything else that the Act has to offer. Interagency collaboration, collaboration with landowners, collaborations with states, tribes, encouraging voluntary conservation, supporting locally led efforts to conserve species, doing creative things with sort of compensatory mitigation and offsets, finding ways to avoid impacts of species before we get to this. So I think that entire suite of uh, actions, which are not viewed as kind of the regulatory hammer of ESA. I think the more we can see the sort of the incentive-driven part of ESA, the better. I think very soon, coming into the future, looking forward to the next 50 years, we're going to have to grapple with some pretty complex challenges around how do we address climate, how do we address climate and biodiversity, what does that mean for species changes and movements and ranges, how are we going to deal with sort of extinctions that we may have no ability to address because climate change is going to be so. I think that's a whole set of issues that hopefully we don't have to touch in the next sort of few years. But if the more of conservation we do now, the less we'll have to deal with those slightly more complex issues.
Yes. Shiva, thank you again so much for your time.
It was really fun. Really appreciate it.
Yes, really appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedule at a busy time of year.
Not at all. Happy to do this. And yeah, really happy and delighted to sort of see folks like you thinking and talking about the Endangered Species Act.
Great. And thanks to all of you for listening. Once again, if you want to learn more about High Country News and read some of our work, go to our website at hcn.org. You can also find us on all the socials, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Mastodon, Threads, the platform formerly known as Twitter. We're at High Country News on all of those. Happy holidays to all. Happy milestone birthday to the Endangered Species Act. And thanks again to all of you for joining us. Thanks, Shiva.
Thank you, Michelle. Happy holidays. Bye-bye.
Take care.